Hi, my name is Larry Metz. I'm an avid deer hunter by choice and a professional meat cutter by trade. For the past 10 years, I've processed many deer for fellow hunters. During this time, many hunters have told me that they would like to be able to process their own deer, but for lack of knowledge, they wind up taking it to someone else to do for them. Today I want to share with you some tips on field dressing, caring for your deer after the kill, skinning, and finally, a step-by-step method to prepare your venison for the table. This method is strictly mine, that I've developed after processing hundreds and hundreds of deer for other people. I feel that these tips will help you. So come on along with me and let me share them with you. Okay, the first thing we're going to talk about are some field dressing tips. A lot of people think that field dressing is not the most important part of processing a deer, but what you do right here sometimes will save you a lot of meat when you get to the table. Some of the tips I'm going to show you today are things that I've learned over the 10 years that I've been processing deer, and I want to share them with you today. So we'll get started. Position your deer with the backside of the deer uphill if possible to start. This lets the entrails run down to the front of the deer. Naturally, on a buck, the first place to start is right here with the sex glands. This is just a matter of carefully removing those. Try not to cut into the meat any more than you have to. The next step is to open the body cavity, slicing through the hide just enough to get through. Once you're through, you put your finger in, lay the tip of your knife on top of the finger. This prevents cutting any internal organs. Cut that down to the pelvis. The next step, come to the back of the deer. Take the knife, Go away, staying away from the anus. You'll feel a bone there. You want to try to keep the knife up against the bone. Cutting around so that is loose. Continue to open the body cavity. Keeping your finger between the blade and the entrails. Open the body cavity up till you feel the sternum, especially if it's a buck and you intend to mount it. That's as far as you'll want to go because of the taxidermist won't want this split all the way. At that point, we're ready to start on the inside of the deer. Again, working around the anus from the inside, using your knife to stay around the bone. Pulling as you're cutting. Take your time. Continue to work around the bone until you've pulled the anus free. Okay. Now as you can see, the anus is completely gone. Now we need to turn and work on the front of the deer. To do this, we need to reposition the deer with the head uphill. Now what this does, again, is it allows the entrails to go to the bottom of the deer so that you can work on the front. Alright, the next step is to break the membrane that holds the liver, or the lungs and the heart. You can do this with your hand as much as possible, thus alleviating any chance of cutting intestines. Once you're through the wall, you'll be able to feel the heart and the esophagus. Take the knife, carefully insert it as far up into the neck as you can. Cutting off the esophagus. Being careful when you bring it out not to cut anything. Then it's a matter of more pulling than anything else. When you get to this point, generally I roll the deer toward its side so that you can better see what you're doing. And again, using more pulling than knife. Pulling the entrails to the outside. There you have it, all in one piece. No cutting. At this point, some of us like to eat the liver. You can separate the liver. You want to take a look, a basic look at the liver, just to make sure that it looks healthy to you. Some people also enjoy the heart. Separate the heart. Again, make a visual inspection of the heart to make sure that it looks healthy. Those two parts are available to you if you so desire. One couple of things I'd like to mention in addition. If you noticed, when we worked on the back of the deer, we did not split the pelvic area. The reason for that is if we split this, these two sides of the hams are exposed. When the person processing the deer processes it, those will have to be trimmed off and not be usable meat. If you leave as much of this hide on as you can, you won't have to trim it off. Another thing I'd like to mention, the tenderloins. These two strips of meat right here, down the back of the deer, are the two most tender parts of the deer. Now this deer doesn't have a particularly large amount of fat. In fact, he has very little. We're laid into the rut and they've run it all off. But if your deer is in fact fat in this area, don't take it off. Leave it on, because if you leave those covered, when you cut the deer for the table, all you'll have to do is remove the fat. The tenderloins will be nice and fresh. If you take it off, tenderloins have a chance to turn dark and you'll have to trim them, because you'll get less tenderloins. This is the filet mignon of the deer. So at this point, basically your field dressing is done. You need to get as much excess blood out as you can. Again, you can do this by rolling the deer on his side. Or letting it run out the back through the anus. I recommend that you do not prop your deer open before you drag it out of the woods. The reason being, if you prop this open, you're exposing it to all the sticks and leaves as you drag it out. If you leave it closed till you get it out of the woods, you'll alleviate that. Another little tip that may help you in taking your deer out of the woods, if you lock the front legs behind the deer's head, like so, then if you have a dragging strap, attach the strap around all three. This makes it much easier to drag. You don't have as much resistance as you do with the front legs down. So, we'll take this and we'll head for the truck. Now that we have our deer at home, I want to give you a few tips about how to take care of it before we get into the processing. First of all, we want to cut the feet off at the knees, both the front and the back. That'll facilitate your handling the deer. Secondly, we want to always hang the deer by the hind legs. The reason for that being, first of all, if your deer is shot into the forequarter section, all the blood will stay down in the more undesirable cuts. The better cuts of the deer are in the hindquarters of the deer. Secondly, by hanging it from the hind legs, it stretches the hindquarters into the proper position for processing. As we discussed in our field dressing section of the video, we talked about not splitting the section between the hams, not cutting between the hams. The reason being, it exposes the two hams. As you can see, these two are exposed. When we get into the processing section, it will be necessary to trim this section off. By leaving the hide on, as we showed you in the field dressing section, that prevents that. So that's one advantage of doing that. Okay. Secondly, you want to clean your deer overall. Just wipe it off, wipe the excess blood out, take any sticks or leaves or anything that you've gotten in it by dragging it out of the field. Remove all that, generally clean the deer up. Next, if you have access to a cooler, which most of us unfortunately don't, you want to hang it in a cooler. If you know someone who has a cooler, they may possibly rent you space for a few days. If they will, take advantage of it. If not, I'll give you a tip how you can cool your deer down for a few days at home. We do this by inserting frozen milk jugs into the body cavity. Before you go into the field, take a few milk jugs, fill them with water, and put them in your freezer. Then when you come home, you simply insert these jugs inside the body cavity, as many as it takes to fill it up. It may be necessary to tie some in the proper position. All right, this will afford your deer the opportunity to cool down pretty quick. A couple of things about the hide. As you know, deer hair is hollow. The same principle that keeps the deer warm in the winter will also keep your deer cool at home. The hair is hollow. It acts as an insulator, and it will keep the cold inside the body cavity just like it keeps the warmth of the deer in the field. After we have the ice jugs inserted, we then want to cover the deer with a tarp or a blanket. Wrap the deer with the tarp or blanket, leaving the top open. This allows any body heat inside the deer to rise and come out the top. One thing I'll mention is not to use plastic. Plastic will not allow the deer to breathe, and it may also cause condensation inside the plastic, which will not allow the deer to cool properly. So these few tips will help you care for your deer. Another thing, you may want to check your ice periodically throughout the day, depending on the temperature, to make sure that the ice is still intact. If not, you need to replace it. But basically, the cleaner the deer, the cooler you can keep the deer, the longer you can keep it. The next step we want to discuss is the skinning of the deer. A few basic things before we start. First of all, if you intend to mount the deer, if it's a buck and you intend to mount the head, or if you intend to have the hide tanned, you need to be very careful about cutting the hide. Use the knife sparingly and use your hands as much as possible. So we'll get right into it here and we'll show you. Start on the inside of the leg. Again, as you're skinning, pull as you're using the knife. Being careful as you go not to slit the hide. As we mentioned in our field dressing section, if you intend to mount the buck, do not split the hide past the sternum, because this will cause the taxidermist to have to sew this, and it will probably wind up costing you more money in the long run. So we don't want to split this at this point. Just continue to skin around the hindquarters. Take the tail, carefully skin the tail out, just pulling it out. Once you have the hide in this position, it's a matter of pulling. Once we have the hide in this position, we then want to start at the bottom of the deer and work up a little bit. If you intend to mount the hide, split the front legs right where the white hair meets the brown. Cut straight up and then toward the center. Starting with the other leg, we do the same thing. Again, being careful not to cut the hide. Now this is a shot. This is where the deer was shot. Taxidermist will be able to sew that. Now as you can see, we're free of the legs. It's a matter of skinning it down the neck. And you want to skin it down about 3 or 4 inches from the ears. Just remember to take your time. There's no hurry. Once we have it in this position, we're ready to separate the head from the body. You do this by taking a saw, again, being very careful not to cut the hide. I generally place my finger so that if the saw touches my finger, I know that I'm getting close to the hide. There you have your deer, ready to go to the taxidermist. Now I suggest that you get the mount to the taxidermist as soon as you possibly can, so that you ensure that your cape stays good and fresh. One other thing I'll mention, if you do decide to cut your hide, be sure that you allow the taxidermist plenty of cape to work with. Cut your hide almost in half. That gives him ample cape to work with. If you cut it too short, he's not able to do a good job for you. So that be sure you leave him plenty to work with. That'll give you a better mount. Before we get into the processing of the deer itself, I'd like to cover a few items that you'll need in order to help you process the deer, starting with a saw. This can be any type of saw. Basically, this is a regular meat saw. The next item would be a couple of sharp knives, followed by a container to hold your trimmings. Next, you'll need a scale. Now, this type of scale is fine if you have one. If not, a regular bathroom scale would work just fine. Then when we get into the wrapping section, you'll need some deli paper to put between the pieces of meat, some freezer tape, and some freezer paper. Other than these items, the only other item that you'll need is a grinder. And we'll get into the grinder a little bit later on when we show you how to grind the meat. A couple of thoughts before we get into the processing of the deer itself. I used to process deer with the bone in, cutting it with a saw, on an electric saw, etc. Then I decided to bone the deer and make all the cuts boneless. I found that by boning the deer, you remove all of the fat and the bone, and that's what seems to hold the gamey taste. By boning the deer, you get a better cut of meat. Everything that's on your plate is edible, and the deer eats so much better. So with those thoughts in mind, we're going to begin. The first thing I'm going to show you, and this may seem like a long drawn-out process, but in the long run, it'll save you time because it enables you to use smaller cuts. What we're going to do is to split the deer from the back clear down to the neck. We're going to split it right in half. And by doing that, we'll be able to work with smaller parts, and it makes it easier for the novice to handle. So what we're going to do, we're going to start at the pelvic bone right in the center, using the spine as a guide. We're going to try to cut right down the center of the spine, right between the two tenderloins, right on down through the spine. we're ready to begin the processing of the deer itself. We're going to take this step by step, and I'm going to show you how to bone each piece, showing you the bones and the bone structure. So we'll begin, first of all, by counting from the neck up 5 ribs. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Cutting between the 5th and 6th rib. Cut all the way out to the spine. Then take your saw. Now, beginning with the shank, run your knife down the bone and simply find the bone. Once you've done that, it's just a matter of removing the meat from the bone. The shank meat, as you can see, contains a lot of sinew. You want to remove the heaviest sinew so that it doesn't wind up in your burger. All right. Next, you can feel the bone in the shoulder. Simply run your knife down that bone, exposing the bone. And again, it's just a matter of going all the way around the bone. Removing the meat. There's a knuckle right here which you will want to break. Pulling this bone out. If you leave excess meat on the bone, you can remove it after you've taken it out. Now, if you notice the white ridge, running down here, that is a bone. Start on one side of the ridge, keeping your knife up against it, down to the end. Then laying your knife flat, bring it straight out. That will expose the shoulder blade. Go to the other side of the bone and do the same thing. Once you have the meat loose from the top of the bone, you simply lift the bone and run the knife down the back. Now, any of these sections that contain hair from the wound, you want to remove those. One thing to remember as you're doing your whole deer, you don't want to put anything into the ground beef or the ground deer that you don't want to eat. A good way to remember this is garbage in, garbage out. The section that we just removed the blade bone from is the better section of the forequarter. This section can be used primarily, I use it for grinds. However, if you so desire, you can remove some stew beef from it. Once you get it to this point, it's a matter of taking off the heavy fat, and the heavy sinew. Again, remember, don't put anything in your trimmings that you don't want to eat. This piece of meat right here would make good stew meat. If you so desire, you would just cut this into pieces, like so, for stew. Alright, once we're to this point, it's a matter of finding the spine, splitting the spine with your knife, like so, and what you're doing is just cutting the meat away from the spine. First one side and then the other. Deer happened to have been shot right near the spinal area. This will all want to be removed. Once you have the meat removed from the spine, lay your knife flat and run down the rib cage. This section here, as you see, contains the esophagus, which naturally you'll want to remove. From this point on, I recommend that this section of the forequarter be used for ground venison. As I mentioned, the better part of the chuck you can use for stew, but this section here, the next section, I recommend that you use for ground venison or for sausage. From this point on, it's just a matter of removing the fat and sinew to lean it up for grinds. The more of this fat that you remove, I don't know if you've ever eaten deer and when you were finished you had a greasy film on the roof of your mouth. That's caused by the fat, the deer fat. So you want to get all that off that you can, along with the major amounts of sinew. So from here on, it's a matter of removing the sinew and fat and leaning it up for grinds. Our next step will be to remove the flank and the rib section. Cut down, exposing, if you notice, the back strap. This is the back strap. These are your chops. You'll want to cut as close to that as you can without cutting into it. If you'll notice right here, it's starting to become exposed. So you don't want to cut into that. You cut as close to it as you can, down to the ribs. Then take the saw, now this section, sometime, as in this instance, can be in pretty bad shape depending on where the deer is shot. As you can see, there's a lot of meat on this particular flank that needs to be cut away. Again, don't kid yourself into putting this stuff into the deer burger, because it just will not eat good. You can be as particular about this as you care to be. Some people would just throw this whole piece of meat away, but if you enjoy venison like I enjoy venison, you'll try to get every ounce that you can. It takes a little more time, but I feel like it's worth the effort. This is the rib cage, and as you know, the entrails have lain next to this when the animal was alive and when we field dressed it. Generally, all I do is remove by laying the knife flat against the ribs, starting at the end. Lay the knife flat. Remove the meat from the ribs. This part I discard. I don't go between the ribs like that, because, like I say, if there's bacteria in the carcass, it's going to lay on the inside of the ribs. So I just generally discard that whole piece. Here again, once you get it to this point, it's a matter of cleaning it up, removing the sinew and the excess fat. Before you put it in the burger. Alright, here we're going to remove what is called the sirloin tip. If you notice the white, the heavy white right here, that is a knuckle. And what we want to do is cut into that knuckle, cut head on and down the sides just a little bit to expose it. Grab your finger so that you expose the knuckle. Work your way down until you feel the femur bone. You see the femur bone right here. Alright, what we want to do is lay our knife against the femur bone, following the white line running down here. So we lay our knife against the femur bone, following the white line down. Until we hit the knuckle at the other end of the bone. Then we simply lay our knife sideways like this, cut on an angle, like so. This is a very versatile piece of meat. What we're going to do is just peel the top cap off, pulling and using the knife. Here again, this piece of meat can be used for several things. You can use this cap for stew if you so desire, or you can simply put it in the burger. The knuckle here we want to remove. Just run the knife around the knuckle. Remove any excess meat. From this point, just generally clean the piece of meat up as far as sinew and fat is concerned. Once you have it to this stage, there are several things you can do. I like to use this as a roast, just like so, or it can be sliced into steaks by merely slicing this way. Slice it into steaks. The next piece of deer that we're going to talk about is the loin. One thing I'd like to mention here that we discussed in the field dressing segment of the video was the tenderloin. That's this piece right here that's exposed. As you remember, we talked about if the deer had fat on the inside when you field dressed it, to leave it on there. The reason being, as you can see, this tenderloin has no fat on it. If that would have fat covering it, when we took it off to process it, all we would have to do is remove the fat. The tenderloin would probably look more like this than it does like this. When it's in this stage, This dark will all have to be trimmed off. And as I mentioned, this is the filet mignon of the deer, so you want to protect that as much as you can. Now we'll remove the loin. The knuckle at the end of the femur bone right here that we just discussed, we want to take the saw and stay about a ½ inch away from that, cutting on an angle approximately like so. The first step is to remove the tenderloin. Trimming away the excess fat. The tenderloin runs from this bone to here. So following this bone, run your knife down the bone until you feel the bone under it. Then laying your knife flat as you're pulling on the tenderloin. All right, this is the tender. These smaller pieces we'll put into grinds. Unfortunately, we're going to have to trim this. There you have the tenderloin. That can either be roasted or broiled or cut into steaks. The next step is to start at this end of the loin. Again, lay your knife against this bone. This piece of meat is equivalent to a sirloin steak on beef. Parts of this contain a lot of sinew. Unfortunately, you can't just slice this the way it is. You must lean it up. Remove the cap at the natural seam. As you can see, most of these are just natural seams. Any pieces that you get off of the loin like this can also be put into stew beef if you so desire. That piece is ready to be cut into steaks. The next step is turn the loin over, exposing the backbone, and right where the first vertebrae starts, insert your knife in there and break the vertebrae and merely push down on it, breaking it loose. Now you have one solid piece of rib there. Now what we'll do, laying your knife against the ribs, follow the ribs down, keeping your knife flat against the bone. Follow the rib cage all the way to the end. Once you get to the end, you'll need to turn your knife sideways just a little. To remove the loin. This again, discard. Now, it's a matter again of removing the fat and sinew. You'll find a piece right here, a natural seam, that you should remove. Because as you can see, there's a considerable amount of sinew in there. Turning the loin over, peel the skin off, this piece comes off like so. Now what we have here is called silver skin. This is very tough. Insert the point of your knife under it as shallow as you can. And just take your time peeling that silver skin off. And just generally clean up the loin, removing any remaining sinew or fat. This piece of meat can be cut into either roast. You can cut it in half or thirds, whatever size roast you would like, or you can cut it into what I call chops. This is similar to like a pork chop on a hog or a strip steak on beef. And it's just a matter of cutting them whatever thickness you desire. If you want a little larger chop, you can butterfly it. That's accomplished by cutting not quite all the way through on that cut, then the next cut, cutting all the way through, and then opening the chop up like that, which gives you a little larger chop. Either way. The final piece we're going to work on is the round or the ham. Following the natural seam here, we want to remove the shank. Cutting down into the knuckle, breaking the cartilage, then just pull the shank out by the natural seam. Here again, as before, it's a matter from here on of following the bone. Here it's very easy to see where the meat touches the bone. One thing I think I should mention, we have to remember, or as I mentioned earlier in the video, I am a professional butcher. I do this, I cut meat every day. I realize that this probably looks very simple to you, and I'm sure that the way I use a knife will not be the way you use a knife. I just want to caution you to be careful when using a knife. Always remember, whenever possible, to cut away from yourself and not toward yourself, as this instance right here. Try to cut away from yourself as opposed to toward yourself. Again, this shank is very sinewy. Remove the major sinew. It's almost impossible to get it all out. This will be used for grinding. Now to the round itself. The first bone we'll remove is the little piece of backbone down at the tip. Next, this is probably the hardest bone in the whole deer to remove. It's very irregular in shape. Be very careful when you're taking this out. Starting at the bone here where you can see it, taking your time cutting around the bone, feeling the bone with your knife. As I mentioned, this is a very irregularly shaped bone. as you see, there is a joint there, and you must cut through this cartilage in order to get that bone out. Right there. This particular meat that was laying here has been exposed, so I just pitched that. Now at this time, if you so desire, you can trim this. Now once again, notice I'm cutting away from myself, not towards myself. Now removal of the femur bone. As you can see, the bone is pretty well exposed, and it's just a matter of taking the knife down the bone, kind of rolling the bone towards you as you remove it. Again, you can remove any excess meat that you leave on it. Now from this point, this is one large muscle which contains 4 smaller muscles. Now what we're going to do is separate these into 4 separate muscles. You do this by laying it face up where you just removed the bone. Take the knife and cut shallowly into the meat until you can see where the seams of the muscles are. As you see, there's one right there. You can just about pull it apart. Just use the knife sparingly to separate the muscles. This is the largest muscle in the leg. Again, it's a matter of removing the fat and sinew. Here again, had we not split the pelvic area when we field dressed this deer, we would not have to be trimming all of this right into this section here. Now there is a caplan here, and again, it's a natural seam. It just almost pulls off. You'll want to remove that because, as you see, there's silver skin and sinew under it. This is a good example of why processing your deer boneless. When you cut these on a saw, a power saw, it's almost impossible to remove all this with the bone in it. Now as you look at this piece of meat, you can see that right here on the side there is a real small muscle. Now I take that off also. Some people choose to leave it on. I take it off. Because usually when you slice it, it it falls away anyway as a separate piece of meat. And as you can see, even there's some hidden sinew and fat. This piece can be butterflied into a steak like we did the chops in order to make it a larger steak. Butterfly it like so. The rest of this piece can be used for several things. It can be used for stew. It can be used as a roast. Or it can be sliced into steaks. One thing I'd like to mention here, if you notice the grain of the meat is running this way. Whenever you cut a piece of meat, it's very important that you cut against the grain directly at a 90-degree angle. If you're going to slice this into steaks, you would cut directly across the grain. That makes the grain in the meat shorter and makes the meat more tender. The next muscle, as you can see here, is a smaller muscle. And there again, following the natural seam, we just remove it. Remove the fat and sinew. Again, this can be used as a roast or as stew. If you choose to cut it into steaks, I suggest again that you butterfly it in order to give yourself, if you slice it straight off, it's an awful small steak. I suggest that you butterfly it, giving you a little larger steak. The third muscle is actually an extension of the shank. Generally, I put this into grinds. It's a tougher piece of meat, a less desirable piece of meat. As you can see, when it's opened up, it contains a lot of sinew. And I suggest it just be put into grinds. Now the final muscle, which is the bottom of the round, has several pieces on the side. This piece also contains an end, and as you notice, everything seems to have a natural seam. It just kind of flows off of there. This side has some hidden sinew. We have to remove that piece of meat in order to see it. Once you're to this point, it's a matter of leaning it up. One thing that's a little peculiar about this piece of meat, that I'll show you here in just a second. When you look at this piece of meat, you would think it was like the other one that we talked about, where the grain runs this way. If you turn it over, however, you'll notice that it actually runs this way. So if you were to cut this way, you wouldn't be cutting directly against the grain. What you need to do is look at the grain and actually start cutting on the corner if you're going to cut it into steaks. A good way to check this is just after you cut it off, feel it. If you cut one against the grain and cut one not against your grain, you can literally feel the difference. Just continue to cut it on down. Again, this piece as a whole can be used as a roast if you so desire, or it can be cut into steaks. In conclusion, and before we get into the grind section of the video, one thing I'd like to mention. Each deer is different depending on how it's field dressed, how it was taken care of in the field, where it was shot. However, if you follow this method that I just showed you, you'll be able to handle any situation. The boning is the same. You may encounter some problems in the area that it was shot, but I think if you follow my system, you'll do just fine. In this grind portion, the first thing I'd like to mention to you is one piece of equipment that we didn't cover. We were covering equipment earlier, and that's the grinder. Unfortunately, there aren't too many of us who are blessed with one of these things. So a couple of alternatives. Number one, you can use the old-fashioned hand grinder, and that is a chore, I know. Another alternative might be that you take your grinds to the butcher shop and ask your friendly butcher if he would be so kind as to grind it for you. A third alternative could be if you have several buddies that you hunt with and you're able to locate one of these small grinders. This happens to be a half horse, which is plenty large for anything that you would do with deer. If you're lucky enough to locate one of these, you may want to chip in together and buy one together. Once you have it, you'll have it forever, and it's just a matter of using it every year after that. So those are some alternatives you have when it comes to grinding. Now I'd like to talk about making your deer burger. First of all, we talked about your container and the scale. The first thing you wanted to do before you ever start cutting your deer, if you can remember, is to weigh your container. This container happens to weigh a half a pound. All right, and we have in the container 9 pounds of meat. I recommend a ratio of 10% fat in your deer burger. That gives it enough fat to hold it together and at the same time keep it from being too dry. If you don't put any fat in your burger, it has a tendency to fall apart when you fry it because it's so lean. Now, as far as fat, there are different types of fat that you can use. Some people choose to use beef fat. Some people use beef suet. I myself choose to use pork fat. I find that it helps the taste of the burger better, and it also helps it hold together better. So I recommend 10% fat in your burger. We have 9 pounds of meat. That means we need to add 1 pound of fat. All right. So now we have 10 pounds of total meat. Right here I'd like to interject a little bit about sausage. If you choose to make deer sausage, breakfast sausage, I recommend that you use a minimum of 20% fat. weigh your scale, weigh everything the same way, except they add an extra 10% fat. So for every 10 pounds of meat, you'd want 2 pounds of fat, 8 pounds of meat. What we're going to do now is show you how to run this through the grinder, which is really not a big deal, but for the sake of example, we'll show you. We're going to run the meat through the grinder for the first grind, mixing the pork fat with the venison as we go. At this point, I'd like to issue a little word of caution. If you're using a grinder of this type, or any type grinder for that matter, always treat it with respect. This is a very dangerous piece of equipment. You can get seriously hurt with it if it's not used properly. Never ever put your hands inside the head. If the meat becomes stuck, or if it needs help to get down into the head, always use a stomper. Okay, at this point, after we have this ground through the first time, now we're going to mix the fat and the meat together so that it becomes more uniform. And at this stage, if we were making sausage, this is when we would add our favorite spice. Depending on how many pounds you're making would depend on how much of your spice that you added. All right, now we have it mixed. Dump it back up for the second grind. Okay, as we grind the second time, we're going to grind directly into our deli paper to wrap for the freezer. In our final segment, we're going to talk about freezer wrapping. This is a very important part of the deer processing also. I'm going to show you two different styles of wrap. One is called a butcher wrap and one is called a drugstore wrap. We'll start by, first of all, packaging the meat. Take whatever amount of chops or steaks you need for your family. Fold them, lay them on the deli paper. Folding them over. The first wrap I'll show you is the drugstore wrap. This wrap is the better of the two because it is a tighter wrap. The whole secret to freezer wrapping is to get as much air out of the package as you can. As you can see, that's a nice tight package. Take a piece of tape, freezer tape, tape both ends. I'll show you that one more time. Remember to squeeze out as much of the air as possible, making the folds as tight as you can. The second wrap that I'll show you is called the butcher wrap. This is the easier of the two wraps, but it's not quite as efficient. But for the novice, it may be the one that you choose to use. Set the burger not quite in the center. Bring the first corner in, fold it down, bring the right corner in, again trying to squeeze out as much air as you can. Bring the left side in, fold it over. Again, tape it with freezer tape. One more time. Fold the corner in tightly. Next, the right corner. Then the left. Roll it over. And tape. There you have two different types of wraps. Either one will do the job. As I mentioned, the drugstore wrap is probably the better of the two because it's much more airtight. The only other thing left to do is to mark your packages. I am blessed with a set of stamps. We just mark the packages accordingly with the different cuts of meat. You can use any kind of a marker to do that. And I also suggest that you date your meat. The date that you're putting it in the freezer. That'll tell you if you have several deer in there, which is the freshest. One other tip I'll give you. When you're putting your meat in the freezer, do not stack the packages on top of each other like so when you first put them in the freezer. The reason being, the package on the bottom doesn't get enough airflow, and it'll take it sometimes, if you have it stacked too high, it'll take it a day or 2 days to freeze, which gives the blood time to squeeze out. I suggest that you lay them throughout the freezer, not on top of each other as possible until they freeze. Once they're frozen, then you can stack them on top of each other without any problem. Well, here we are at perhaps the most enjoyable part of the hunt, the table. I hope the tips that I've shared with you today will enable you to get more enjoyment out of this part of the hunt than you ever have before. So good luck and good hunting.